It was a quiet street in Park City, Kansas, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors. They waved hello, they shared stories over the fence. And on that street lived a man named Dennis Rader. He seemed like any other man. He was a husband, a father of two. He was the president of his church council. He even worked for the city as a compliance officer, the kind of person who might remind you to cut your grass. No one would have ever guessed what was hidden behind that ordinary face. No one could have imagined the terrible secrets he kept locked away. It was a mask, a perfectly crafted disguise he wore for decades. And then, one day, the mask came off. The news spread like a fire through the small town. Dennis Rader, the family man, the church leader, was a monster. The shock was a physical thing, a wave that hit the community and left them breathless. How could it be? The man they saw every day, the man they trusted, was responsible for a string of terrible crimes that had haunted their city for 30 long years. The friendly neighbor was a killer. It was a truth so strange, so horrifying, it felt like something from a nightmare, a story that couldn't possibly be real. But it was. The revelation shattered everything his friends and family thought they knew. His own children had grown up in that house, completely unaware of their father's double life. They had family dinners, celebrated birthdays, went on vacations. All the while their father was secretly living out a dark and violent fantasy. He had slipped out into the night to commit unspeakable acts, and then returned home as if nothing had happened. He would sit at the dinner table, a loving father on the outside, a cold-blooded killer on the inside. It was a chilling performance that lasted for more than 30 years. And so, the people of Park City and nearby Wichita had to ask themselves a terrifying question. If a man like Dennis Rader could hide such darkness, who else could be hiding secrets? The very idea changed them. Trust was broken. The safety they had always felt was gone, replaced by a deep and unsettling fear. The man they thought they knew was a stranger, a phantom who had walked among them for so long. And the story of how he was finally unmasked is a story of patience, a story of a single fatal mistake, and a story of a terror that had a name all along. Long before anyone knew the name Dennis Rader, they knew him by another name, a name he gave himself. He was the BTK killer. It was a signature, a brand he created to spread fear, and it was a name that described his terrible method in 3 simple, chilling words. B for bind, T for torture, K for kill. He wasn't just committing crimes, he was creating a legacy of terror, one that he wanted the whole world to know about. He wanted credit for his work. He wanted everyone to remember the name he had chosen for himself. The name first appeared in a letter. Not long after his first murders in 1974, a letter arrived at a local newspaper. It was hidden inside a book at the Wichita Public Library. The author claimed responsibility for the killings of the Otero family. And in that letter, he laid out his terrifying signature. Bind, torture, kill. It was a direct message to the police and to the public. He was telling them who he was and what he did. It was a boast, a declaration from a killer who was proud of his evil deeds. The city of Wichita now had a name for the phantom that haunted its streets. This self-given nickname was a key part of his twisted game. It wasn't enough for him to commit these awful acts in secret. He needed recognition. He craved the attention. By calling himself BTK, he turned his crimes into a public spectacle. He was the director of his own horror movie, and the whole city was his unwilling audience. The name became a symbol of fear that would hang over Wichita for decades. Every time a strange noise was heard in the night, every time someone felt they were being watched, the letters BTK would come to mind. He had successfully branded his terror. And so for years, that was all they had. Not a face, not a real name, but a gruesome acronym, BTK. The police hunted for a man who called himself a monster. The media reported on the letters from BTK. The community lived in fear of BTK. Dennis Rader, the man, could walk freely among them. He could go to work, go to church, and raise his family. But the killer, BTK, was a ghost, a terrifying legend he himself had created, and for a very long time it seemed like the legend was all anyone would ever know. The man behind the letters remained a complete mystery. Dennis Rader was a patient hunter. He did not choose his victims at random, he stalked them. He watched them for weeks, sometimes even months. He learned their daily routines. He knew when they left for work, when they came home, and when they were most vulnerable. He was like a predator studying its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He called this trolling. He would drive around looking for a target, And once he found one, the careful, terrifying process of watching and waiting would begin. It was a cold and calculated method, completely without emotion. His plan was always meticulous. He would often cut the phone lines to the house before he entered. This would prevent his victims from calling for help. He would then find a way inside, sometimes by tricking the person into opening the door, or sometimes by simply breaking in when he knew they were home. He brought a kit with him, a bag containing the tools of his trade, ropes, tape, and other items he would use to control his victims. He wanted them to feel helpless. He wanted them to know that he was in complete command of the situation from the very beginning. Once inside, he would carry out his terrible three-step process. First, he would bind them. He would tie their hands and feet with rope or cord, ensuring they could not fight back or escape. This was a critical part of his ritual, a way to establish his dominance. Then came the second step: torture. This was not always physical. It was often a mental and emotional torment designed to create the ultimate state of fear. He would talk to them, tell them what he was going to do, and prolong their terror for as long as possible. It was this part of the crime that he seemed to enjoy the most. Finally, after he had bound and tortured them, he would kill them. His methods varied, but his goal was always the same. He was there to take a life. After the crime was over, he would sometimes take a souvenir, a small item from the victim's home. It could be a piece of jewelry, a driver's license, or some other personal belonging. These were his trophies, mementos of his kills that he would keep hidden away, allowing him to relive the terrible moments over and over again. He was not just a killer, he was a collector of memories, each one a reminder of the power he held over another human being. The murders were not enough for Dennis Rader. He needed more. He needed to be famous. So he began a long and chilling conversation with the police and the media. He started writing letters. These were not simple notes. They were elaborate, taunting messages designed to mock the investigators who were trying to catch him. He would describe his crimes in graphic detail, providing information that only the killer could know. It was his way of proving that he was the real BTK, and it was his way of staying in the spotlight, long after the crimes themselves were committed. His letters were often filled with arrogance. He saw himself as smarter than the police. He would give them clues, but they were often misleading, designed to send them down the wrong path. He gave himself the name BTK and demanded that the media use it. He was controlling the narrative, shaping the story of his own reign of terror. It was a twisted game of cat and mouse, and for a long time, he was the cat. He seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, a phantom voice speaking through letters and news reports, always one step ahead. He would sometimes include evidence with his letters. He sent a poem about one of his victims. He sent a copy of a victim's driver's license. Once he even sent a doll that was tied up in the same way he had tied one of his victims. Each package, each letter, was a fresh wave of terror for the community and a fresh source of frustration for the police. He was playing with them, dangling pieces of the puzzle just out of their reach. He clearly enjoyed the fear he was creating, and he loved knowing that the entire city was hanging on his every word. This communication went on for years. He wrote letters in the 1970s, and then he went silent. For a long time, many people thought the BTK killer was gone. Maybe he had died or been arrested for something else or simply stopped, but Rader was just being patient. He was living his normal life, raising his family, all the while keeping his dark secrets. The silence was just another part of his game. He was waiting for the right moment to return and remind everyone that the monster was still out there, watching and waiting. For more than a decade, there was nothing. The letters stopped. The killings stopped. The name BTK, once a source of constant fear, began to fade into a dark chapter of Wichita's history. The case went cold, detectives retired and new ones took their place, but the files on the BTK killer remained open, gathering dust. Had he moved away? Was he in prison for another crime? Or had he died? No one knew. The city of Wichita held its breath, hoping the nightmare was finally over. The silence was long and deep, a quiet pause in a terrifying story. But Dennis Rader was still there. He was living his life in plain sight. He was working his job, leading his church group and being a father. He hadn't gone anywhere. He was simply dormant, a volcano waiting to erupt again. He kept his trophies, his souvenirs from the crimes hidden away. He would revisit his dark deeds in his mind, reliving the power and the control he felt. The urge to kill and to taunt was still inside him, a sleeping monster. He was just waiting for the right time to wake it up and remind the world of his existence. The silence was finally broken in 2004. A local newspaper ran a story about the 30th anniversary of the Otero family murders, the first known crime of the BTK killer. The article wondered what had happened to him. Was he still out there? This article was like a spark. It reignited Dennis Rader's massive ego. He couldn't stand the idea that people might be forgetting him. He wanted them to know that he was still around, and that he was still smarter than everyone else. And so, after years of silence, the game was about to begin again. He decided it was time to reach out. He sent a new letter. It contained a copy of a victim's driver's license and photos of her body, pictures he had taken himself back in 1986. The package was a shock to a new generation of police officers. BTK was back. The ghost who had haunted their city for so long had returned. The fear that had faded over the years came rushing back in an instant. The whispers of the past had become a shout, and the cold case was suddenly, terrifyingly hot once more. The game was on. The return of BTK in 2004 changed everything. The police were no longer just looking at old files, they had a live connection to the killer. He was communicating with them again, and this time, they were determined not to let him slip away. They set up a special task force, bringing together experienced detectives and new technology. They had a chance that investigators in the 1970s never had. They had modern forensic science on their side. The key was to keep Rader talking. They needed him to keep sending them letters, packages, and clues. Every piece of communication was a new opportunity. Rader was more than happy to communicate. His ego was now in full control. He sent a series of packages to local news stations. He sent puzzles, poems, and even a chapter list for a book he was writing about his life, which he called The BTK Story. He was completely confident that he could not be caught. He believed he was invisible, a master of his own dark craft. He even started leaving packages in public places like a bowl of cereal on top of a street sign, enjoying the thrill of the chase he was orchestrating. The police decided to play his game. They communicated back to him through coded messages in the newspaper's classified ads. They wanted him to feel safe. They wanted him to trust them. They knew that if he got scared, he would disappear again, perhaps forever. So, they carefully built a relationship with the killer, all while secretly analyzing every single thing he sent them. They looked for DNA on the envelopes and stamps. They studied his writing style. They examined the digital data on the items he sent. They were slowly, carefully, closing the net around him. One of the biggest questions was whether the killer from the 1970s was the same person communicating with them now. To prove it, Rader sent them another package. Inside was a floppy disk. He believed that the police would not be able to trace a floppy disk back to him. He was wrong. This was the era of digital forensics, a world he did not understand. The police now had something tangible, something modern, something that could potentially lead them directly to the man who had called himself BTK for 3 long decades. The cold trail was now burning hot. Dennis Rader was proud of his intelligence. He believed he was smarter than the police, smarter than the FBI, smarter than anyone who was hunting him. He had outsmarted them for 30 years after all. So, when he had a question, he decided to ask the police directly. In one of his communications he asked a simple, fateful question. Can I communicate with a floppy disk and not be traced to a computer? Be honest. It was an incredible moment. The killer was asking the police for technical advice on how to remain hidden. The police saw their chance. They had to be careful. If they lied and he found out, he might vanish forever. If they told him the truth, he might not send the disk. So, they gave him an answer they knew he wanted to hear. They placed an ad in the newspaper that said, "Rex, it will be okay." They were telling him it was safe. It was a calculated risk, a gamble that his huge ego would make him believe them. They were betting that he wanted to believe it was safe because he was so eager to send them more from his story. The gamble paid off. Rader, feeling confident and secure, sent a purple 3.5-inch floppy disk to a local television station. He thought he had deleted the file, but he didn't realize that digital information can be recovered. On that disk, police forensic experts found hidden data, metadata, that he thought was gone. This metadata showed that the disk had last been used at the Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, and it showed the name of the user who had last saved a document on it, Dennis. The net was closing in. The police now had 2 crucial pieces of information, a church and a first name. They quickly discovered that the president of the church council was a man named Dennis Rader. It seemed too good to be true. Could this ordinary man, this compliance officer and church leader, be the monster they had been hunting for 30 years? They started looking into his life, his work, everything about him. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, all because of one floppy disk and one colossal, arrogant mistake. The police had a name, Dennis Rader, but they needed proof. They needed something that would definitively link this church president to the BTK crime scenes. They needed his DNA. Getting a DNA sample from him directly would be difficult without alerting him. So, they came up with another plan. They knew Rader had a daughter. They managed to obtain a DNA sample from one of her recent medical exams using a subpoena to get it from the clinic. It was a long shot, but it was their best hope. The lab went to work. They compared the daughter's DNA to the DNA that had been collected from under the fingernails of one of the BTK victims back in the 1970s. Because a daughter shares DNA with her father, forensic scientists could look for a familial match. The investigators waited, their hearts pounding. This was the moment of truth. After 30 years of searching, of dead ends, of taunting letters, it all came down to this one scientific test. Was Dennis Rader the man? The results came back. It was a match. The DNA from Rader's daughter showed a strong familial link to the DNA from the crime scene. They had him. On February 25, 2005, the police pulled Dennis Rader over as he was driving home for lunch. He was calm. He thought it was a simple traffic stop. He had no idea that his secret life was over. The officers approached his car, and with decades of mystery finally at an end, they placed him under arrest. The man who called himself BTK was in custody. The news was stunning. When his face was shown on television, people couldn't believe it. This was not a monster from a horror movie. This was their neighbor, their co-worker, the man who wrote tickets for overgrown lawns. The unmasking of Dennis Rader sent shockwaves through the community and his own family. His wife and children were completely devastated. The man they loved and lived with was a complete stranger, a cold-blooded killer who had hidden his true self from them for his entire life. The mask was finally off, for good. With Dennis Rader in custody, the full, horrifying story began to come out. He did not deny who he was. In fact, he seemed eager to talk. During his interrogation, he confessed to 10 murders. He spoke about them in a cold, detached voice, as if he were describing a trip to the grocery store. He showed no remorse, no sadness for the lives he had taken. He seemed proud of his work, and he calmly explained the details of each crime to the stunned investigators. He even seemed to enjoy the attention, finally able to take credit for the terror he had caused. His trial was a media sensation, but there was no real doubt about the outcome. He had confessed. The DNA evidence was solid. In court, he stood and described his crimes in his own words. He spoke for a long time in chilling detail about how he stalked, bound, tortured, and killed his victims. The families of the people he murdered had to sit and listen to the man who had destroyed their lives brag about his evil deeds. It was a final, cruel act from a man who had no empathy, no soul. Because he committed his crimes before Kansas reinstated the death penalty, Dennis Rader could not be executed. Instead, he was sentenced to the maximum punishment possible, 10 consecutive life sentences. That means he will spend the rest of his natural life in prison. He will never be eligible for parole. He was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison, where he remains to this day, locked away from the world he once terrorized. Today, Dennis Rader is just a number in the prison system. He is an old man, and the power he once craved is gone. He lives in solitary confinement, isolated for his own safety from other inmates. The man who desperately wanted to be famous for his crimes is now locked in a small cell, a forgotten monster from a past nightmare. The story of BTK is a chilling reminder that evil can wear an ordinary face. But it is also a story of how patience, technology, and one killer's overwhelming pride finally brought a 30-year reign of terror to an end.